right through the middle of London runs the Thames. This mighty tidal river was once the artery of the city, but now all the bridges seem to sew the whole place together, linking the north with the south. Powerful and functional, graceful, sleek and slender, artistic and colourful, we've got innovative and modern bridges beside the grandeur of Gothic design and Victorian ingenuity. And an important part of London's social and economic progress can be measured by its very first bridge, London Bridge, which has existed in 4 very different incarnations that date back to medieval and even Roman times. I've just come down Fish Street Hill, and this is Lower Thames Street. And underneath my feet are the remains of the Roman bridge, the very end of the Roman bridge on the north bank. Of course, we're now about 100 metres away from the river, because in those days it was very much wider, with sloping, muddy banks. Ali Taylor from the Thames Explorer Trust helps schoolchildren discover London's history on the banks of the Thames. Romans built the first London Bridge, yes?
They did,
and it's just downstream here.
Yep.
How did they choose where to build it?
Well, one of the reasons was this was the highest point that the tide reached in those days. And so they got a free lift with the tide up the river.
Right.
Another reason they built it here was because it doesn't look like it now, but this area was full of islands and it was very shallow, and so they could build a bridge across. So it was a good bridging point, good fording point.
Is there any evidence of it here on the bank of the river?
Well, a couple of weeks ago, we had a bit of a star find. And these were the children, because the children are wonderful at finding
things. They've got sharp
things.
eyes, haven't they?
They have indeed. Now, those are Roman floor tiles.
It's amazing that they haven't knocked off in all that time. It's at least 1,500 years old, isn't
Well,
it?
what happens is, you see, they're buried in the mud.
OK, and then they get protected.
This is a fantastic archaeological site because you've got the tide coming in and out. So twice a day, the River Thames kindly does the excavation work.
Right.
So if we came down here next week, we'd find something totally
else.
different.
Gotcha.
So that's why it's always really exciting to come down here, because you never know what you're going to find.
No one knows quite what happened to the Roman London Bridge. Some historians think it fell into disrepair after the Romans left. Others believe its wooden construction was patched up and used right up until the building of London's very first stone bridge in 1176. This is the church of St Magnus the Martyr, and just through there is what used to be Bridge Street, the approach to the old London Bridge. Come and have a look. These lumps of stone were actually part of the old London Bridge. Bridge Street was here, this was the end of the bridge, and it went straight across the river there. Oh, they seem to have built something in the way. Still, I'm told there's a lovely model of the bridge inside the church. And here it is. Just look at this. What amazes me is all the buildings on the bridge. There are 3-storey houses, there are shops down below, there's a chapel, the Thomas à Becket Chapel, there's a gatehouse here, there are pigs in the street, and lots of chaps on horses and cows here as well. Here's a bit of naked bridge, but mostly it's covered in buildings. Now, in the old days, before this, they could put a single arch over a stream, but here this is 276 metres long, and they had to have, look, 19 arches. Absolutely extraordinary, arch after arch, and they're incredibly narrow too. Just look at this one here. Hello. You can see it'd be quite tough to get a boat through there, it's so narrow. And in fact, if the tide was unfavourable, there could be a 6-foot drop from your side upstream to my side, so that you'd shoot through at tremendous speed. It was called shooting the bridge, and the watermen loved it, but it was dangerous. A lot of them died. And a proverb came which said, the bridge was for wise men to cross over and for fools to go under. one reason that they built all those houses and shops on London Bridge was that they always needed money. The fact is, the bridge was always in need of maintenance and repair.
London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady.
The fair lady in the rhyme could well have been Eleanor of Provence, Henry III's queen. She misspent funds meant for maintenance of the bridge. In 1282, 5 arches collapsed and she quickly returned responsibility for the maintenance to her subjects.
Wash away, my fair lady.
Amazingly, the bridge was maintained for almost 200 years. But after another fatal collapse in 1437, something more serious had to be done.
Over the next 35 years, arch by arch, London Bridge was rebuilt, but it still needed constant repair. Its collapse could have been a disaster for the capital, as the nearest crossing was 20 miles upriver in Kingston. Fishmongers' Hall on London Bridge Approach is home to one of the City of London's guilds or livery companies that were formed in early medieval times to protect and regulate specific trades.
Here inside Fishmongers' Hall, with its wonderfully rich decoration, they've got a whole mass of information about the history of London Bridge. And I'm off to meet the curator, Claire Crawford, in the courtroom. So, Claire, this must be the old London Bridge with all the buildings on it.
Yes, it is. The buildings were taken off in 1757. They caused a sort of impediment to the traffic flowing over London Bridge.
They did. It wouldn't be easy to drive anything over there, would it?
That's right. And there were shops and all sorts of businesses. It became apparent in 1820 that the city were going to have to look at building a new bridge. They held an architectural competition in 1825, but decided after they'd picked a winner that they were going to ask John Rennie to design the bridge anyway, because he had designed Waterloo and Southwark bridges.
Right.
And so John Rennie's design was put up.
This looks a bit of a mess, this picture. What's going on?
Well, it does look like rather an unusual topic for a painting, doesn't it? But it does actually show the demolition of the old London Bridge that started in 1832.
Ah, so this is the remains of it?
That is, yes, that's right.
Wow.
And you can see how the approach to that bridge went past the door of St Magnus the Martyr Church. This looks to our eyes, as I say, an unusual topic, but the fact is that 5,000 people a day came to see the bridge being demolished.
Really?
Yeah.
Did they sell tickets?
They should have done, I think.
Yes.
But yeah, I'm sure a few of them took the odd piece of stone home and put it in their pockets as a souvenir.
The demolition of the medieval London Bridge had sparked an awareness of its historical value, and all sorts of little trinkets, egg cups and snuff boxes were made out of fragments of the bridge's stone and timbers.
Curiously, the finest artefact of all from the old London Bridge is this chair. It's not terribly comfortable, I have to say, because I'm sitting on a piece of stone. Claire, tell me about it. You allege that all these timbers came from old London Bridge, but they're not covered in barnacles or seaweed or anything.
No, these were very large old timbers, some of them driven into the riverbed. They were taken out, preserved, dried out, and then the inner parts of the wood were used to make the chair that you can see here. We've got here the old London Bridge with its 19 small arches there.
Only a very small boat would fit through the middle there.
And then the second one down here is the second London Bridge that was designed by John Rennie. And then further down you've got Waterloo and Southwark bridges, both of which were also designed by John Rennie.
So the old bridge that we're interested in is this one of Rennie's.
That's right.
On its completion in 1831, John Rennie was knighted, and his magnificent London Bridge still stands to this day. But as you can see, this London Bridge here is definitely not Rennie's 5-arch design. So where has it got to? Well, it can be found in the unlikely home of Lake Havasu in the Arizona desert. Sold in the 1960s, it's rumoured that the purchasers, the McCulloch Oil Company, thought they were actually buying Tower Bridge. Bridging nothing except desert sand when it was first reconstructed brick by brick, it now forms the centrepiece of this man-made fishing lake and is a major tourist attraction.
You don't have to go all the way to Arizona to see Rennie's London Bridge, because this is one of the original arches, the one on the south bank. And also part of his structure are these steps taking you up onto the bridge. They're now called Nancy's Steps because in the Dickens novel Oliver Twist, this is where Nancy gets murdered.
Not much, however, of the old medieval London Bridge remains. You can see two of its alcoves preserved in Victoria Park, and another a little closer to its original home here in the grounds of Guy's Hospital. But my favourite piece of the medieval London Bridge is far more colourful and vibrant than these old stones.
And it's here, just round the corner in Newcomen Street, this fabulous coat of arms. You see at the top it says King's Arms 1890, that's when this pub was rebuilt, but underneath it says George III 1760. That was the year that George III came to the throne. In fact, that coat of arms was on the south gate of London Bridge in the time of his dad, George II. And it was in 1760, the whole lot was demolished, all the houses, the south gate and everything, and sold, and that's why it landed up on this pub. But when the bridge was there with the arch, everyone who crossed the bridge must have walked under that arch and indeed under that coat of arms. And I think I ought to do it too, just in remembrance. There's no bridge there, but there might be a bar, mightn't there?
For hundreds of years, the only bridge to cross the Thames in London itself was London Bridge. If you wanted to cross anywhere else, you would have to be ferried over by a waterman. At the time, this business was at least as important as the taxi business is today.
But there's one ferry that still crosses the tidal Thames in the same place as it has for hundreds of years, right here in Twickenham. Right, Francis, can you take me across?
I can, yep.
Do you get a lot of business here?
Yes, weekends mainly.
So it's tourists?
Tourists and residents, I would say.
Right, but not commuters with briefcases?
No.
None of
We
that.
only start at gentlemen's times. That's 10 in the morning till 6.
So why don't they bother to go to the bridges?
Well, Richmond Bridge, from the steps round, is 1¼ miles.
That way?
That way.
Yes.
And Teddington Lock, to your right, is 1¾ miles. That's a footbridge over the lock.
So that's a longish way, a longish walk?
It is.
It's what's more, it's a rather uncomfortable footbridge, isn't it? It's sort of steep.
Yes,
yeah.
very steep. Yeah.
Yes.
Many years ago, I believe, all the residents of Richmond Hill,
That's up there, yes?
that's up there, got a covenant to say that the view from Richmond Hill to the source of the river mustn't be obscure.
So they said no bridges,
No bridges, nothing.
and therefore there's still a ferry running.
Yeah.
That, of course, was not to be the fate for the rest of London's watermen. I steadied my sea legs again for a ride a few miles downstream. The expansion of the capital and the ever-growing congestion on London Bridge finally got work underway on London's first new bridge over the Thames in nearly 700 years.
The Corporation of London held back the building of Westminster Bridge for 70 years for fears of the damage it would do to the trade in Southwark, and also because they were worried about impoverishing the ferrymen. They even bribed the King, Charles II, to oppose the building plans.
The first Westminster Bridge that opened in 1750 was dubbed the Bridge of Fools. Corners were cut in its construction, and its cheap, shallow foundation suffered from constant subsidence. Several of the piers had to be rebuilt before it was finally demolished in 1862 and completely rebuilt as the bridge that stands today. The construction of that first Westminster Bridge, despite all its faults, meant that holding back the demand for more bridges across the Thames became impossible.
The grandest and most famous bridge in the whole of London is a monstrous Victorian original built right next to the Tower of London. It's Tower Bridge.
It's also one of the newest, completed in 1894. It was financed by the tolls and taxes levied on London Bridge, and it cost more than £1 million. It was arguably the most ambitious civil engineering project at the time. over 400 men were employed to build the structure, and over 70,000 tonnes of concrete were used to build the bridge's supporting piers alone.
Today, thousands of tourists come here just to look at this fabulous structure. But back in 1876, just the idea of building a bridge here wasn't at all popular. Now, the City of London were desperate to ease the traffic flow around the city, which is just the other side of the Tower of London. But the Thames was a major shipping lane, and a bridge here might spell the end of the upstream docks.
So how would the bigger ships reach the docks further upstream? Many designs were put forward with various clever ideas for letting the ships through. Eventually, it was Horace Jones's ingenious drawbridge design that was chosen. It lifted the whole road.
Now look, they're opening the bridge. It's up at nearly 45 degrees. There's a boat coming down. So they've shut off the traffic, they've shut off the pedestrians, and they're all gathered here. In the old days, Port of London was the busiest port in the world, and they kept having to lift the bridge several times a day. So the pedestrians were allowed to go up in lifts up the towers and walk across the high walkways at the top so they wouldn't be interrupted. But in fact, nobody bothered to go because it was such fun standing here watching the bridge go up. They all just stayed here as spectators, more or less as they are today.
The bridge lift these days involves simply pressing a sequence of buttons, engaging the hydraulic pumps that power the bridge, stopping the traffic, and releasing the safety bolts that keep the bridge in place. David, who was in charge of opening the bridge, was kind enough to let me have a go at the final stage of lifting.
So how are we doing? What else has to happen?
It's now protected, so now we're ready to do a lift.
Really? Can I do it?
Now we're ready to do a lift. All we do is check and make sure the bridge is clear of everybody.
Right.
And now you can go ahead.
You don't have to warn anybody? You just do it?
We just do the lift now.
And hold it down?
You just pull back and hold it back. If you watch the screen,
Oh, fantastic.
you watch the screen will actually go with it.
Oh,
Show
yes.
you how you're moving.
Oh, wow. Hey, this is something I always wanted to do.
Now.
Open Tower Bridge. 45 is a long way up.
It actually goes up to 87 degrees.
Gosh. Oh, the pigeons are getting all unhappy up there. We're disturbing their
We
resting
don't like
places.
pigeons up there.
Oh, here comes the barge. Right, so then I just
Okay, yes.
let go.
That's it. This will come to rest.
Now, this chap here was the chap who used to drive the bridge in Victorian times. In fact, I think he's been doing it ever since, but he's not looking terribly well at the moment. They didn't have green electric buttons in those days. They had these vast levers. The first two levers here are for the large and small engines. It says large and small. You could decide which engines you wanted to drive. This is for the resting blocks, the brake. You had to operate each of these in turn, and more brake, and finally the pawl, and each one had to be over like that before you could begin to open the bridge. And then when you shut it again, you did that. And when you were going to open the bridge, you did it with this, which is basically just to open the hydraulic valve down below and let in originally the water, and today it would be the oil. Now I'm right down in the bowels of the building, below water level, and this is an accumulator. The way the Victorians did it was to generate, using a steam engine at the end of the bridge, high pressure water at 750 pounds per square inch, which came in here in pipes. But they couldn't make it fast enough to lift the bridge directly, so they had to accumulate the energy. And what they did was to pump that high pressure water into a cylinder in the middle of this. And the water pushed the piston up, which lifted this crosshead and lifted the whole of this vast weight. And it went up the rails, you see there are guide rails in the walls, up about 20 feet. And then they had accumulated a mass of energy. And with 6 of these accumulators, they had plenty of power to lift the whole bridge.
Despite switching to electricity in 1976, the basic Victorian engineering principles that power Tower Bridge remain the same today as they were over 100 years ago. I was taken further into the depths of the bridge to see the bascule chamber that was built to accommodate the bridge's counterweight as it opened.
It's moving. It's moving. Are you sure it can't just break loose and go whoop?
It cannot break loose, no. All systems fail, it just locks up solid wherever it is.
Now, as much as the crew and I knew this was true, there is still something decidedly uncomfortable about having hundreds of tons of lead and iron bearing down on you.
You can see the sky through that, well, almost.
Fresh air.
Yeah. That is one whole lot of machinery, isn't it?
Each end of the bridge weighs 1,200 tons, but they're relatively easy to lift because the counterweights coming toward me in the bascule chamber act in the same way as the kid at the other end of a seesaw.
I just hope he's right and that it is going to stop quite soon. Ah, it's stopped.
Or broken.
Broken. I don't believe you could break this bridge.
Though only a short ride downstream from its nearest rival, London Bridge, Tower Bridge stands as a reminder of London's seafaring heritage of the not-too-distant past and marks our progress as we build yet bigger and bolder bridges even further towards the sea.
This is the Queen Elizabeth II Bridge. It carries the traffic on the M25 from Thurrock across to Dartford. This was finished in 1991 and it's actually 2 miles long and the closest bridge to the sea.
As American President Franklin Roosevelt once said, there can be little doubt that in many ways the story of bridge building is the story of civilization. For by it we can measure an important part of a people's progress. And today the bridges tie together the whole of London, linking the north and south marshlands of Roman and medieval times into what has become the modern world city that London is today. London's past is steeped in conflict. The size and shape of the city were for hundreds of years dictated by the threat of war. War is a terrible and destructive force, but actually it's played an enormous part in shaping London as the city is today. Just below me, to the south of London Bridge, is the spot where London was actually founded, because in about AD 50, 2 Roman roads were diverted to meet at this point, and those roadworks were the beginning of London. When they'd finished the roadworks, they built a bridge, and a settlement sprang up on both sides of the river. The Romans established good relations with local tribes, and the new city began to prosper. But they'd reckoned without a nasty revolt. Londinium's buildings were made of wattle and daub. There was no local stone and few defences had been built. The city was fat and vulnerable, like a sitting duck. And the person who inflicted this destruction on the undefended was a woman, Boudicca, or Boadicea as we used to call her when I was a lad. She was queen of the Iceni, a fierce tribe from East Anglia, and when she came charging into London they were so terrified they ran for their lives, leaving just the women and the children to be slaughtered. In fact, when the archaeologists came to look, the only thing they found from this period was a layer of red clay where the whole place had been burnt to the ground, and a whole lot of skulls in the Warburg River. Nevertheless, in spite of the lack of stone, London was soon built up again, and this time they made sure there were fortifications. Now, you may wonder why I'm going into an underground car park. Well, it's not because the Romans parked their chariots down here, although actually they may have, because in Roman times, ground level was down here 6 meters below where it is today. No, I'm going because behind these 2 doors is the remains of a massive Roman building project, one that determined the shape of London for 1,500 years. Just look at this. This is part of the original Roman wall, built all the way around the city of London. But in fact, this wasn't the first military building they did, because they needed somewhere to house their soldiers, and so they built a fort.
And this is one of the gatehouses, and the rest of the fort would have been in the back there somewhere, and that's where the Romans would have been having their breakfast, or whatever Roman soldiers do. They built the gatehouse around AD 120, and they started on the wall something like 80 years later. And it's astonishing how good the condition of the masonry is. Just look at this here. Absolutely, it could have been built last week. Well, a few years ago anyway. And if you listen very carefully, you can almost hear those Roman soldiers back there brushing their teeth, polishing their weapons. No, perhaps it's just the traffic overhead.
The wall stretched around Londinium for 2 miles. It was to form the boundary of the city for more than 1,500 years. The area it encompassed is now the heart of the City of London.
Building this wall was an absolutely mammoth operation. Just look at it, it's 6 meters high and it's something like 3 meters thick. And the whole lot is built of these amazing stones. Now, there was no local stone. London is built on clay, so they had to import this stuff, ragstone. And they had to bring in something like 1 million of these. How on earth did they get here?
I went across the city to another section of the wall at Cooper's Close to meet Jenny Hall, the Roman curator at the Museum of London.
Well, Roman London didn't have any available building stone, so it had to be got from further afield, and it comes from the Medway area of Kent. They quarried it from there.
That's 100 miles away.
It came by boat, and we know that there were boatloads bringing up this building stone to Roman London, because one of the boats actually sunk at the mouth of the fleet, and we found some of its cargo of ragstone in it.
So when was the wall built?
Well, we think it was built about AD 200, but it's a coin that was found in rubbish that had built up against the wall that helps us give a date to it.
Right.
And that is a silver coin
Oh, fabulous.
of Caracalla.
So that's genuine silver?
Yes, and this coin dates to AD 213 to 217. What's interesting about this coin, found with it were some moulds, and someone has taken a fresh silver coin and pressed it into the clay to make
Right.
moulds, so that we've got a forger at work.
How many do you find?
Over 700.
700? This is a serious industry
It's
then.
very serious, yeah.
Gosh,
Yes.
forgers at work.
Yeah, at a time when there was rampant inflation, so they obviously sort of wanted a lot of extra coinage.
Oh, fantastic. Successive generations built the wall up higher and higher to keep out all those aggressors. And when they ran out of aggressors, they started using the wall for other things. Now, just look at this bit. These are just platform sockets, but look up there. That was obviously an arrow slit. You can still see the slit at the bottom. And then above it, recycled Roman tiles, and then they bricked the whole thing up, presumably because the people living inside couldn't stand the drafts. Have a look round here. Now here you can see that the wall's actually been converted into a house. Look, there's a flight of stairs going up, and then there's a fireplace up in the bedroom. Lucky people, I don't have a fireplace in my bedroom.
Bits of the wall survive throughout the City of London, but one section was discovered more recently right next to one of London's major tourist attractions.
For 200 years, the only defence on the south side of Londinium was the river. But then about AD 390, the Romans decided they needed something more solid, and they built this. In fact, you can still see down here the orange tiles that they so often built into their walls. And this wall was to play an important role in the development of London's defences. Because when the Normans came along, the fact that the wall was here and on a prominent position overlooking the Thames meant this was the perfect place for them to make their mark. And look, they built to last. After his victory at the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror still had to face the wrath of a whole lot of angry Saxon Londoners. In fact, it was so dangerous in the city that he had to go and live out in Essex, and they hadn't even built the central line then. In order to calm down his new subjects, he had to intimidate them, and he ordered his soldiers to build certain strongholds within the town against the fickleness of this vast and fierce populace. And the biggest of those strongholds was this colossal tower. It's 90 feet high, it's 118 feet wide. It was the biggest thing they'd ever seen. In fact, this hugely ambitious building was the second largest Norman tower in the world. Jane Spooner is Curator of Historic Buildings here at the Tower. Jane, who built this wonderful tower?
Well, we know that from 1077 onwards it was built by Gundulf, the Bishop of Rochester.
Oh, wonderful. A bishop?
Exactly, yes.
Sounds unlikely, doesn't it? So, what was it built for?
We've got two defensive functions going on here, in that it's seen by anybody coming upriver, and also it's seen by the citizens of London, who were particularly rebellious.
And it must have been terrifying, that sort of height.
Absolutely. It was terrifying for a number of reasons. One was that it was a very large stone building, which the Saxons wouldn't really have seen much of before, and that immediately denoted power, wealth, dominion. It's a very effective fortress, and it was built from stone. Its entrance isn't on the ground, it's high up, so you have to make an effort to get to it. And also, some of the walls are at least 4 metres thick in parts. So,
4 metres?
Absolutely.
Wow.
So it's a very, very strong fortress building.
William's Tower still dominates the site today, but his descendants carried on strengthening the fortifications. One of the biggest builders was Richard the Lionheart, who spent only a few months of his reign in England, but spent huge amounts on fortifying the tower and its outer walls.
One of the most interesting buildings that survives from Richard's day is this, the Bell Tower. This was, incidentally, where they locked up Sir Thomas More for the last 15 months of his life. But in Richard's time, what's interesting is this extraordinary polygonal shape to the ceiling. That's actually a very early example of Gothic, and they used it extensively much later on to hold up the roofs of churches. This tower is actually the second oldest in the whole complex, only the White Tower is older. But the shape of the whole Tower of London wasn't settled until many years later.
Henry III was responsible for building a curtain wall which surrounds William's original tower. Edward I carried on the programme of improvements and built a second curtain wall and the moat. He created the concentric castle that you see today. This wasn't a new idea, but Edward the Master Builder developed it to the point of perfection.
Anyone who wanted to attack the tower would have a pretty tough job. First of all, they've got to get in off the river, okay, that's not easy. And then outside that wall, there was a moat. It might have been 9 metres deep and full of raw sewage. Then there are chaps firing arrows from that wall to deter them, and even if they can get over it, they're then stuck in this space between the walls with chaps firing arrows from there and from here, because there are trained archers with longbows shooting down. Take that, you rotter! Ah, got him! And even if they can get over this wall, then they've got to go and attack the tower, 90 feet high. I wouldn't fancy it.
Even today, the tower remains a very secure place. After all, the crown jewels are still kept here.
Halt! Who got her?
The keys!
Whose keys?
Queen Elizabeth's keys!
Of course, there is one weakness in the tower's defences. Legend has it that if these ravens leave the Tower of London, it will crumble, and the kingdom itself will fall apart.
This is the Royal Naval College at Greenwich, which was originally built as a seamen's hospital by Christopher Wren. And Britain's most famous sailor, Horatio Lord Nelson, lay in state under one of the domes while people came past to pay their respects. The rise of the Navy really started under Henry VIII, who curiously had a palace down here. He was an aggressive chap and he attacked France and was terrified that we'd be attacked in turn. So he built up the Navy and he built an enormous chain of coastal defences all the way from Hull all the way around to Milford Haven.
This fort at Tilbury was established by Henry to protect London from attack by sea. England's defences relied on intercepting would-be invaders before they landed. The fort was massively enlarged by Charles II, who feared attack by the Dutch. Elizabeth I built this fort, Upnor Castle, to protect her massive new naval dockyards at Chatham in Kent. It was overrun in 1667 when the Dutch sailed up the Medway and burnt the British fleet in the docks, humiliating Charles II. The threat of invasion remained very real until Napoleon was finally defeated in 1815. London entered an unprecedented period of prosperity and was safe from attack by land or sea for nearly 100 years. The next threat was to come from the air.
Before the war, London was the greatest city in the world. It was the hub of a vast empire and home to 8 million people. But the Blitz changed all that. Terrible bombing. Just look here. Here is a row of Victorian houses built around 1850. Along comes a massive bomb and flattens 15 of them. Here we are. All this lot was rebuilt after the war. Churchill himself predicted that 1 week of bombing might produce 40,000 casualties. He described London as the greatest target in the world, a tremendous, fat, valuable cow. But in spite of all that, the authorities didn't want to dig any deep shelters for the people. They thought that everyone might be so happy to be down there, they'd be too frightened to come up again into the open air. So what most Londoners had was one of these. This is an Anderson shelter, named after the Home Secretary at the beginning of the war. And basically it's a hole in the ground with a bit of, well, earth over the top really, and you had to build it yourself. Les, I'm a bit young to remember Anderson shelters, but you had one, didn't you?
Yes, we had one, and I also helped to put it up and build it with my father and my brother.
How old were you?
I was only 8 years old at the time.
Oh, wow. Did you have to make it yourself?
Yes, we had to construct it ourselves. They bought these shelter parts on a lorry and just left them with you. We then had to dig the hole out, and then it was constructed. We stood it up, bolted it together with the bolts in the top. Along the back there was a bar onto which bolted the escape hatch, because the centrepiece in the middle was so that you could get out the back if it got blocked up at the front. And then you put the earth over the top, and that was it.
Right. How much earth on top?
The more the better, really. If you didn't have any, you could have got shrapnel falling down, even maybe not from bombs, but even from the guns, and it could have possibly have gone through the shelter. By having the earth on the top, of course, it stopped any stuff getting in there. The only thing used to get in was water.
More than 2 million Anderson shelters were distributed to the public, but they offered only limited protection from the destruction of the Blitz. Londoners who didn't have a garden had in theory only the option of the street-level shelters that the government had provided. They too were extremely cramped, and again didn't provide much protection from a direct hit. Within days, others had found their own solution: buy a penny ticket for the tube and sleep on the platforms.
The people who ran the country didn't really have much more protection than the average Londoner. There were plans to build deep underground shelters way outside London, but then people might think they were being deserted. So in the end, they came here to what had been the Office of Works. It was reckoned to be a strong building, and of course it had a basement, which was very handy. It was close by number 10 Downing Street and also the Houses of Parliament. And so this became the Central Emergency Headquarters, now known as the Cabinet War Rooms. This is the War Cabinet Room. It's quite exciting to be down here. This was where the Cabinet met for the first time on the 15th of October 1940. At least that was the first time Churchill came down here, because the day before a bomb had actually damaged 10 Downing Street, and he realised that the heads of government ought to be underground and a bit further away from the bombs. I'm sitting in the seat of the Cabinet Secretary. This is Churchill's chair. That would have been Attlee, and there were the 3 chiefs of staff in the middle of the room. But the war was really run from this room. This was where Churchill worked incredibly long hours. If necessary, he even slept here. And you'll see that all the walls are covered in maps, and just in case anyone dodgy came round, there were curtains that he could draw to cover the maps up and hide all his secrets. Now, the chap who really knows about these rooms, and this one in particular, is Neil Cook here, who was involved with the restoration of the whole building. Neil, why did they choose this building?
Well, some people suggest that it was because of its proximity to Downing Street.
It's only sort of 20 yards or something, isn't it?
Exactly. But I think possibly the real reason is that this was originally a windowless, fireproof archive store for architectural drawings. And the thought was that they could deliver materials here and that the work to fortify the place could actually go on unseen.
How did they fortify the building?
They brought in millions of bricks. They brought in enough steel sheeting to probably cover a football pitch. Into that they cast concrete about 5 feet thick, and the whole of that was supported on about over 900 steel beams. And of course Churchill used to come along and watch the bricklaying as it
and he was a bricklayer, wasn't he?
Well, he was a member of the Bricklayers Union, and he built a lot of walls down at Chartwell. And there's one story actually which John Colville, his private secretary during the war, recorded in his diary, which is that Churchill was wandering about on the steel beams as they were casting the slab and jumped off and landed in some wet concrete. But it'd be kind of funny to imagine this
wonderful
large red-tongued man
yes.
sort of up to his waist in concrete.
Well, yes.
Outside, not only had hundreds of London's historic buildings been damaged or destroyed, but by the end of the Blitz, vast tracts of the city had been wiped out. The terrible damage caused by the war had changed the face of London forever.
London had to be rebuilt, and some people saw this as a great opportunity to put up wonderful new structures.
Like this, the Barbican complex. It was built because the Corporation of London was worried about the decline in population of the square mile caused by the Blitz. Flats were built around gardens and water features, creating a haven in the middle of the city.
The Barbican is absolutely massive. It includes that church over there, that tower, and this enormous concrete block with these miles and miles of walkways. It makes it feel almost like a walled town, which is actually rather appropriate because the word Barbican means a fortified outpost. Now, some people see it as a terrific triumph because with these walkways, the space for pedestrians is doubled and it's a sort of oasis away from all the noise of the traffic underneath. Other people see it as an absolute nightmare because once you get inside, you can never find your way around. It's far too easy to get lost in there. Opinion on the Barbican is sharply divided. There was a recent poll among Londoners to try and find the best and worst buildings in the city, and the Barbican was voted the 12th best and the 11th worst.
The Barbican's use of concrete towers paved the way for dozens of other high-rise developments across London. Many, though, were built on the cheap. In some areas, there was only enough money for the most basic social housing. Post-war regeneration is still going on. Parts of the Docklands have lain abandoned for more than 50 years. London still faces one major threat, though. But unlike the guns and bombs of foreign invaders, it's come from the very source of London's prosperity, the River Thames. London has always been at risk of flooding, but it took the Canvey Island disaster of 1953 for a serious solution to take shape.
This is it. This is the world's largest movable flood barrier. It stretches 520 metres right across the Thames, and you can see there's a whole bunch of piers there with a sort of silver pagoda on top of each. Now, between each pair of piers, there's a huge steel gate. It's like, well, imagine a vast oil drum chopped in half down the middle, lying on its side on the bottom of the river, and it can tilt up like that and actually lock off, shut off the river from the sea. And you'll see that number 4 actually is already up. They're repairing it or something. So they can completely separate the sea and the river. It was built this 21 years ago, and it's been raised only 80 times since then, but it's happening more often now, and with global warming and the rising sea level, they're going to have to think of something better quite soon.
If not, the city that has repelled so many invaders could fall victim to something as simple as the rising tide. From all over the world, people come to visit London's great palaces. And in this programme, I'll be looking at palaces built both for royalty and for working people.
Behind me is one of London's great palaces. This is Hampton Court Palace.
Hampton Court Palace was originally built for Henry VIII, though Sir Christopher Wren added some bits in the 17th century. It's a magnificent building with stunning gardens, and it was Henry's showpiece.
Here I am in Henry's Great Hall. It's 100 feet long, 40 feet wide, and 60 feet high. The most striking thing about this room is the hammer beam roof.
The hammer beams support the arch, meaning the roof span can be much wider. And it's ludicrously over the top, decorated with endless bits of carving and gilding. Henry really wanted to show off.
There's another rather intriguing thing about the roof. On every hammer beam, there's a little chap leaning over and apparently looking down and listening to what's going on below, to all the scandal and the gossip among the courtiers. Now, we don't know who those chaps are. They may have been representations of courtiers themselves. But the fact is, because they're in the eaves, they came to be called eavesdroppers.
Up on the roof, there's equally intricate decoration. These beautifully crafted brick chimneys were the status symbols of their time, although all 241 are Victorian copies of the Tudor originals.
I love those Tudor chimneys, and I couldn't help wondering how the Victorians copied them so beautifully. I mean, here we've got a bit of chimney. Well, it's not a real one, you understand. It's a sort of pretend chimney with those terrific spirals. And obviously what you need is a whole lot of bricks shaped like that. Now, how on earth do you shape a brick like that? Well, fortunately, there's a man who knows here. Richard, where do you start?
The first process is to make the brick flat and square.
Then you have to cut it a bit thinner, obviously, because this is thinner than that.
Exactly.
How do you cut off the extra bit?
We use these wire saws.
So this is just wire?
It's just ordinary twisted wire.
OK, so you cut it down to the right shape.
Process, yes.
Yes, but what I want to know is how you cut this amazing shape here, this curve.
We cut the brick into this mould, and we've got to hold it in place so that we can actually do the cutting process.
Very high tech. Yeah, great. OK.
And we follow this profile all the way down through. Brush that off.
That's fabulous. Right, and so there is the rounded bit to match that. So all you have to do now is saw through the other half.
Yes.
Once we've done that, we'll have one of these.
You'll have one of those.
Well, I think that's fabulous. And how long do you reckon it would take you to make that?
Maybe 20 minutes, half an hour to get a rough shape.
Well, that's very impressive. So that's the Victorian method. Now, Gerard, how did the Tudors do it?
With this.
What's this?
Brick axe.
A brick axe?
A brick axe.
I've never heard of such a thing.
Yes.
What an amazing weapon. OK, so where do you start?
Here's a Tudor brick. And this is actually a genuine Tudor brick.
So first of all, you've got to square that off,
yes,
like
that
the Victorian
has to be
ones.
rubbed down. Once that's done, then the templates can be applied to it. And what would happen then is we scribe it using this rose head nail.
Oh, wonderful.
And then we follow that round,
right,
scribing in to get the shape all the way round, like that.
Right.
The brick axe would very rapidly dull if we tried to cut out all of that shape from that brick in the first place.
Right.
So we cut the angles out on the corners using this pad saw here, and we take it down to form a series of fillets down to that line, which we are then able to chip off using the brick axe. And of course this is a tool that wasn't seen on a British site now for over nearly 150, 160 years.
Let me have a go before you finished it. You're going so incredibly quickly. So then you just go...
That's it. So break your fillet off, just give it a nice little smart tap.
Oh.
That's it, lovely.
Right, so suppose you finish that. What about this curved bit? Because that looks impossible.
It does, but again, it can be done exactly the same way again.
And you're just doing it by eye down to your scribe.
Down to my scribe line. Bringing that round, getting that through. like that. So
That
now
is
I've got my-
spectacular.
my draft.
Now, how long do you reckon it would take you to make a finished brick?
I honestly believe that I would be able to do one of these between about every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes.
Ah, so you might in fact do it quicker than Richard.
You'd be surprised.
All right, are you ready, chaps? Looks to me like... Richard, thank you very much indeed. That was great. Gerard, thanks.
Thank you very
Now
much.
I can make my own brick.
Thank you.
Buckingham Palace is arguably the best-known palace in the world. It was built by George IV, but the palace we see today is not how he or his architect John Nash envisaged it. The original plan was that Nash had a U-shaped building. This is the back, sides of the U, and in the front, the Marble Arch as the main entrance. But when Queen Victoria moved in, she started having children all over the place, and the palace was just too small. She added a new front, and the arch had to go. So in 1851, they moved it here. And the trouble is, they never got round to finishing it. It was supposed to be wonderfully elaborate, gorgeous carvings commemorating the Battle of Trafalgar, all that stuff. And here we have a very plain arch in the wrong place. Maybe if I borrowed a chisel, I could improve it a bit. I don't think I can improve this one, though. London has actually voted Buckingham Palace their 4th most loathed building, so I think we better move swiftly on. This other famous London palace is much more impressive, although it's the home of politics rather than of kings. This is the Palace of Westminster, which used to be a royal residence. From way back in the time of William the Conqueror all the way through to Henry VIII, all the kings lived here. And then in 1512 it burnt down and Henry VIII had to move out, and the politicians took it over for the House of Commons and the House of Lords. In 1834, another fire caused massive damage and very little of the old palace remained standing. In its place, the Victorians built this, a wonderful Gothic building. Hello, you must be Malcolm.
Hello, very good to meet you.
I gather you're going to take me round this fabulous building.
I am indeed.
So this is the old bit, yes?
This is the medieval hall, Westminster Hall, of the old Palace of Westminster.
So this survived all the fires?
This survived all the fires and, of course, the main fire in 1834.
Right.
And it goes back to the 1090s.
So it's almost 1,000 years old?
Indeed. This is the central lobby, the midpoint of the Palace of Westminster building. We're standing, in fact, on the midpoint here. You're in the middle of the new palace, and behind you, you've got the corridor leading to the House of Commons debating chamber.
Right.
And then directly opposite, at the end of this long corridor, you've got the House of Lords.
In the spirit of the Victorian age, the architect, Sir Charles Barry, had agreed to finish building the palace within 6 years. He was perhaps a little ambitious. It actually took 25 years. Did Barry do all these details as well?
Well, Barry was helped in much of the work on the palace by his good friend Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin.
So where can we see the best of Pugin's work?
I think in the Palace of Westminster, undoubtedly in the House of Lords debating chamber.
OK, well, let's go and have a look. Gosh. Wow. That is quite something, isn't it? Just the ceiling is fantastic. And then that slab of gold at the other end. And this is the most amazing throne. Do you think they let me say that?
I think not on this occasion. Well, everywhere you look, you can see the hand of Pugin.
Right.
Even on the wood carving on the bench ends.
Pugin created such an enormous amount of work that the pressure sent him mad and he died prematurely. But just look at his incredible achievement. The most distinctive feature of the Palace of Westminster is Big Ben, which is not actually the tower or even the clock, but the bell. The trouble is, it's 334 steps to the top. So why did they call a bell Big Ben?
Well, there are various theories. Nobody actually knows the answer. One is that the Commissioner of Works was Sir Benjamin Hall, and at some point they had a debate to try and decide the name of the bell, and he gave an incredibly long and boring speech, and at the end of it, when he sat down, somebody said, why don't you just call it Big Ben and have done with it? But then there's a rival theory. There was a prize fighter called Benjamin Comte who weighed 17 stone. And what's more, he was always called Big Ben in the papers and so on. And maybe it was called after him. Anyway, I think it's about to go. Listen to this. The quarter bells first. That's one of those experiences I've always wanted. It is amazing to be right beside this vast bell, which you can hear for miles across London. Wonderful, wonderful experience.
The 19th century Londoners saw magnificent palaces being built. Palaces for royalty, palaces for politicians. But what about ordinary working people? Well, down there is an example of what the public demanded. Palaces for the people.
There, got it, just over there, that spike on the horizon. You remember the Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park in 1851? Well, when the exhibition was over, they moved the entire Crystal Palace to Sydenham. That's there, southeast London. And of course, the people up here in the north were cross because they didn't have a palace for the people, so they built this, Alexandra Palace. And actually, this is done rather better because the Crystal Palace burnt down in 1936, and this is still open.
This was the place to come for theatre, concerts, circuses, fairgrounds, and too many sports to mention.
Once, Blondin, the famous tightrope walker, walked across the south face of the palace while cooking an omelette. I don't know whether he took the cooker with him, but anyway, cooked an omelette on the wire. This was a cornucopia of delights for the working man. But Alexandra Palace has always been dogged by bad luck. Some people say this was because of a gypsy curse which was laid on the palace when it was first built and a traveller was evicted. Anyway, it was opened on the Queen's birthday in 1873 with tremendous excitement. In fact, in 16 days, 124,000 people visited. And then disaster struck. It caught fire and burnt to the ground in an hour and a half. 3 members of staff were killed. A brand new palace was opened only 2 years later in 1875, and again it was a great success. In 6 months, nearly 1.3 million people came here. But the success didn't really last because there were endless problems about maintenance. People went bankrupt and the whole place had to close down from time to time. And then in 1980, disaster struck again, and the whole of this wing behind me burnt to the ground. But it has lasting fame. Because it's on such high ground, this became the home to a brand new technology in 1936, television. The BBC transmitted the first real television pictures from here in 1936 and went on transmitting television for 47 years. In fact, for many years it was a major production centre with a studio and all the other technical gubbins.
There's also a television transmitter at the site of Ali Palace's former southern rival. But of course the original Crystal Palace was located at Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition of 1851. Here it was open for only half a year, but an astounding 6.5 million people went to see it.
The Great Exhibition was a tremendous success and made a profit of £186,000, with which they bought 87 acres of South Kensington. On the land, they built the Science Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and this, the grandest of all, the Natural History Museum.
Alfred Waterhouse was the architect responsible for this amazing building, a palace of nature.
This is Rosemary Hill, who's an expert on Victorian architecture. I gather it was even more elaborate in the original design, is that right?
It was going to be much bigger. Waterhouse was given a budget of £500,000 to start with, which was then drastically cut, and so he only got to build the front and not the back and the sides, as he would have liked to have done.
Did the work go smoothly once it had started?
No, it didn't at all. What he was working with was a very Victorian technique, which they like to call constructional polychromy, which meant that instead of applying the colour to the surface of the building, as the Georgians had done, you actually built it in, as you can see here.
But was it very complicated, therefore?
No one had used terracotta on this scale, and of course that turned into a nightmare for the contractors, who in the end went broke because they couldn't provide enough fast enough.
Right. And presumably when the public arrived for the first time, they came in through this great sort of cave entrance.
It's a great arch, like a great opening in a cliff face, preparing you for what's inside.
Right. Well, let's go and see what is inside. After you. This is the most extraordinary building, isn't it?
It's a wonderful combination of the drama of scale and the drama of detail. One of the things that Victorians were very good at, especially after the Crystal Palace, was great public spaces. So you've got these great staircases, which are borrowed really, I think, from Italian palazzos.
And the detail, I mean, apart from the huge space, I love all these bricks and the little patterns in the brick, and these monkeys.
The Victorians loved narrative. Theirs was the age that produced all the great novelists, George Eliot, Dickens, and their buildings are full of stories that tell you what the building is as you move around it.
Now, these figures are obviously gorgeous. Who designed them?
Well, Waterhouse himself designed them. These are Waterhouse's drawings for the little animals and figures. They're extraordinarily delicate. Waterhouse actually wanted, when he was little, to be an artist, and his parents thought it would be more respectable,
right,
more secure. He became an architect. And on the whole, his buildings, he built some of the great big bruising buildings of the 19th century, like Manchester Town Hall. When you see those buildings, it's extraordinary to see the delicacy of his drawing. And here, I think in this building, he actually managed to bring the two things together.
So these are the monkeys, and you can see that he's drawn several different versions. And presumably these were then copied directly, were they?
They were copied directly into models, yes.
Right. I mean, it must have been a nightmare of a job to turn 2 dimensions into 3.
Although I think it's a very architectural line. He's thinking in almost 2.5 dimensions as he's drawing. You can see that tail coming off the page.
Yes. And the lion?
The lion's wonderful, isn't he?
He is. I love the 4 paws, like a great big pussycat, the 4 paws in a row there. Well, there's a massive terracotta about, and I wondered how the stuff is made. John, suppose we want to make a column or pillar like this. This is terracotta, yes?
That's right, yes.
How do we do it?
Well, first of all, we make a plaster model.
Hang on a sec, that's bigger than this.
This is bigger. This is made about 8% larger, like in order to accommodate the clay shrinkage actually during drying and firing. Once we've made the plaster model, we then make a reverse plaster mould.
Okay. Oh, I see. So we need to put some clay in. Should we take these off, do you think, before we start messing with the clay? It's heavy, this stuff, isn't it? What do we need to do?
What you've got to do is to roll it out on the bench.
Roll it out?
So that you get all the air out of the clay.
Right.
De-air it.
Oh, I guess if you have air bubbles, then that'll spoil the finished thing, won't it?
That's right, yeah. What we need to do then is to throw the clay inside the mould. What we do is put the clay in there and we thump it around.
Oh, that's brutal.
It is.
Doesn't it ruin your knuckles?
That doesn't help now.
Wow.
And then as you'll build that up to about a thickness of about 1.5 inches.
Can I do a bit?
You certainly can.
I'm a bit nervous about this because I value my knuckles. And you really do it all by hand like that?
Everything's by hand, yeah. Imagine it'll take about an hour to press a block like this.
Do you think we could peel away that little bit and see if it's worked? From the top?
Let's just give it a good there.
You don't trust my walloping, do you?
You could probably...
Oh, hey!
Look at that, you can start to see...
Oh, yes.
You can start to see it.
That's fabulous. And this is the very piece that I was trying to make. Isn't it fantastic? Now, once it's been fired, terracotta can't be cut. It can't be shaved to fit. Every piece has to be made exactly the right size and shape so that they all go together to make an enormous three-dimensional jigsaw. And just look at the resulting picture.
The tradition of building palaces for the working people wasn't just a Victorian thing. The origins of the old Wembley Stadium also lie in a grand exhibition, the Empire Exhibition, opened in 1924 to show off the best of the British Empire. With the worldwide appeal of football, Wembley Stadium's 2 squat towers became as iconic as Big Ben. No wonder there were howls of outrage when the old stadium was knocked down in 2002. But a new Wembley is on its way. Its grand central arch will hold up most of the roof. Mike Richardson, the man in charge of the project, told me more.
Now, the most obvious thing is the arch. Can you give me an idea how big it is?
Up to its apex is 133 metres high, which is 4 times the size of the old Twin Towers, and we could roll the London Eye underneath it.
You could roll the London Eye under it? Now, that would be a good demo. Could we try it?
Yeah.
How wide is it?
It's 7 metres diameter. We could put a tube train down the middle of it.
It's an enormous thing. What's it made of?
It's basically made of tubular steel, welded together in elements.
And how did you get it up there?
Well, they lifted the arch from the horizontal, and it was pulled in 5-degree increments, and we kept doing that over a period of a month.
A month?
And we went without a hitch for a month, and it went from horizontal to where it is now at 112 degrees.
How are you going to maintain the arch?
Its maintenance is either by abseiling, or we've got a little trolley that runs right up the centre of the arch and over the top, if you'd like to give it a try.
No, that's not a job I would very much like to have. What about capacity?
We've got 90,000 here, all seated, no columns in the way, unrestricted viewing.
So everyone's got a fantastic view. Well, I wouldn't. I'd get stuck behind a column. I always get stuck.
No, you won't find one, I'm afraid.
Just look at that. This brand new palace for the people is soon going to become a London icon, like Buckingham Palace or Big Ben's Tower. People will remember the Wembley Arch, not just across London, but all the way around the world. Some of London's newest landmarks are skyscrapers, and there are going to be more of them. Just look at all those cranes. More and more office buildings reaching up into the sky. It must have been very different 100 years ago. Then the city was dominated by buildings of state and churches. It was a city of spires. "600 years ago, London was dominated by the magnificent old St Paul's Cathedral. Its 425-foot spire was the tallest ever built. But disaster struck with the Great Fire of 1666. The blaze raged for 4 days and nights and destroyed old St Paul's. And what arose from the ashes was this, the wonderful new St Paul's, an iconic building known all over the world. And at 365 feet high, it was until the 1950s the tallest building in London. It's 510 feet long, 280 feet wide, and the architect was Sir Christopher Wren. London has often been described as Wren's city, and a total of 51 churches were built by him, but his greatest feat is St Paul's.
What must it have been like as a building site?
A massive activity, because they were knocking down the old building while they were building the new one. In fact, it took 20 years to demolish old St Paul's. The stone they got from that building, they used for the construction.
So you mean there were chaps with pickaxes there, yes, putting the stone in barrows, rushing it up, and masons there?
That's right, using it for the basic wall structure of the crypt.
So an army of people, an absolute anthill.
Yes.
Who actually oversaw it, ran it on site?
over all these people, Wren himself, who came to the site every Saturday and was said to have been carried up in a basket to look at the work as it was going on.
Oh, now all of this end is nice and sort of bright and clean the stone, but all of that end is black dark. Why is that?
Well, it looks dark from here. It's mosaic work put in the late 19th, early 20th century. The Victorians were very unhappy about the internal decoration of St Paul's. They felt the building had never been properly finished. Wren had wanted it white. In fact, all these walls were originally painted white. But the Victorians felt that the choir in particular should be more colourful.
The inside of St Paul's is truly spectacular, but it's what lies behind the scenes that's even more impressive.
Now, Gordon, I don't understand where we are. We've come up hundreds of steps, spiral staircases. Out there is obviously a dome.
Yes.
But in here, there's a great lot of brickwork. And not only is it brick, which we don't see from inside, but it goes straight up. It's not curved.
Yes, well, this is the brick cone that supports the stone lantern right at the top of the dome.
Right.
When you look at the dome of St Paul's from a distance, it looks as if the lantern is resting on the dome, the outer dome.
So why can't it rest on that outer dome?
Well, this outer dome is just a cladding of lead on wood.
You mean this isn't strong enough to hold the lantern up?
No, it's not doing any supporting work at all.
I'm now right at the top of St Paul's, and I don't believe that in this programme there'll be a grander building than this. I'm standing exactly on that brick cone. This is called the Golden Gallery, and there is the great heaviest stone lantern. And a rather curious feature of the lantern is that in one of Wren's early designs, it looked very much like the gherkin there. He was 300 years ahead of his time. It took 36 years to complete this building, and it was the first English cathedral that was completed within the life of the architect. And when he finally died, they put an inscription in the crypt that says, "Si monumentum requiris circumspici." If you're looking for my memorial, look around you.
Wren's classical masterpiece dominates the city. But journey further west up the Thames and you'll see an example of classical architecture made modern.
Even from a distance, Battersea Power Station looks big, but from here it's absolutely enormous, a temple of power. It was originally planned in the 1920s to help cope with London's rapidly rising demand for electricity. And when the first station, there are actually two back-to-back, when Battersea A opened in 1933, there were wonderful comments in the press. Somebody even wrote, "It bids fair to make St Paul's Cathedral share her proud place as London's architectural landmark." They used to bring the coal in by river, and the coal was hauled out by cranes. There are two of them still there, amazingly. Just imagine the scene. The barges jostling for position, the cranes heaving the coal onto the side, the enormous noise. It must have been quite a sight for sore eyes. This is Turbine Hall A, the original one built about 1930, and it's absolutely massive. What's more, it's beautiful. Just look up there, do you see these columns, fluted columns going all the way up, and yet a huge great industrial crane across the top. It's halfway between sort of Art Deco museum and industrial building site. And the size is truly extraordinary. If you take the whole building, the footprint is the same size as Trafalgar Square. And they tell me you could fit St Paul's Cathedral inside without touching the walls. Now, I reckon that Ealing Feeder 3 needs a bit more power, so we'll just turn it up a bit here. And just look at this control panel. Hundreds and hundreds of dials and levers and switches and knobs. And such a grand room, the control room. There was a beautiful parquet floor underneath this hardboard. The control desks all covered in walnut veneer. And the ceiling, amazing Art Deco ceiling. Now, I reckon that's quite enough of that. Whoops. The chimneys here are 337 feet high, and when Station A was opened, they were the highest chimneys in London. The architect desperately wanted to make them square because he thought it would be more in keeping with the size and grandeur of the building. But unfortunately he was overruled, and so they're round. Well, wish me luck. How often do these things fall down?
Just once.
Just once?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Oh, I have to say, I hate heights, and I'm very glad that we're only 250 feet up and not right at the top of those chimneys. It's now being regenerated as a commercial and leisure complex, and they're going to revive another thing that used to happen way back then. They used to take water from the river, warm it up, and then pump the warm water to that huge biscuit-coloured complex of flats over there. That's Churchill Gardens, which was part of a massive post-war rebuilding programme that went on all over London.
German bombing in World War II had destroyed almost 500,000 homes, so rebuilding was an absolute necessity. But it was also an opportunity to move families out of slums and into new, modern housing.
Jerry, you know all about this sort of thing. I guess the houses they built after the war were a huge improvement for working class people.
Yes, it's difficult to exaggerate the scale of the housing problem in London in the 1940s. Something like 60% of all Londoners lacked access to a bath, even a shared one. Many working class families lacked hot water. Now this had to be dealt with immediately after the war had finished. But London couldn't expand outwards because it was locked into the green belt and kept in place by planning policies. Central London land values were very high, and so the only solution was to build upwards.
So what sort of buildings did they build?
They built towers, and government was encouraging local authorities to build thousands of houses per year. And so they gave extra subsidy for each dwelling which was built above a certain height.
Oh really?
Like this.
More money for the top ones?
More money for the high ones. This is one of the most famous tower blocks in London. It's Trellick Tower by Erno Goldfinger. Ian Fleming famously pinched his name.
Oh really?
For a James Bond novel. It took 6 years to build and was opened in 1974. It's 31 stories high, 328 feet, I think.
Right. So what's the separate bit up the side? Is that the lift shaft?
It is a lift shaft with walkways onto the main block. At the very top, there's a fantastic viewing tower for the residents who look all over West London.
They must be able to see for miles.
Right across London itself and out to the other side.
Terrific.
In its early years, it worked very well. It was very popular among its tenants. When people objected about tower blocks to the newspapers, people from Trellick Tower wrote and said, come and see us, we're very happy. But it went down as so many of these things did in the 1980s. But in the 90s, it's really picked up. I understand that a few of the flats have been sold off. But people are proud and happy to live here. It's got protected entrance with a concierge. It works well as housing now.
Now, I gather it's a listed building, is that right?
That's right, it was recently listed as one of the key examples of what's called brutalism in modern architecture. As a building form, it's a magnificent statement, I think, even if you find it hard to feel that it's lovely. But it is a magnificent building.
Be honest, do you like it?
No.
I don't think I do either. But it wasn't just for housing that they started building tower blocks. Once they started doing it for offices, the London skyline was changed forever. Just after the Second World War, there was a limit to how high anyone could build in central London. It seems amazing now, but no one was allowed to go above 100 feet. This, of course, was very unpopular with the young, enthusiastic architects who'd seen the skyline in New York. So when they relaxed the restriction in 1954, there was an absolute explosion of tall buildings, mostly office blocks. Within 15 years, there were 100 buildings more than 100 feet high and 16 more than 300 feet, including this one, Centre Point. When it was finished, Centre Point was the highest building in London, 384 feet, 36 stories. It's a very ingenious building because it's built out of precast concrete slabs. They're H-shaped. And if you look at the windows, you'll see that up the middle, the vertical bits, are the cross pieces of the H's, and all the H's are stacked on top of one another. It's very high, it absolutely dominates the streets around here, and it makes it very windy down at ground level, and for those reasons some people absolutely hated it. But it's now grade 2 listed. I have to say, I still don't like it very much.
However, the problem with building big in London, oddly enough, is the ground itself. Unlike the rock of New York, London is actually floating on a bed of soft clay. So engineers had to come up with ingenious ways to stop tall buildings literally sinking into the ground.
And here I am in the basement of the BT Tower. Now, 174 feet down below ground level is hard chalk. And in principle, for the foundations, they could have sunk piles all the way down into the chalk, but it's a very long way. It would have cost an awful lot of money. So what were they going to do? Well, an Italian firm came to the rescue, and they made a raft. And the raft is down there. If you look, that black bit down there is actually the top surface of the raft. The raft is 90 feet square and 3 feet thick and reinforced with 6 layers of steel cables. Sitting on top of the raft is this great reinforced concrete pyramid here. You can see it's 23 feet high, and the top is just there, flat top. And sitting on that flat top is a reinforced concrete cylinder that goes all the way to the top of the tower. So the entire tower is resting on this pyramid, on that raft, floating on the clay. Wonderful.
Doors closing.
I'm now on my way up to the 34th floor. This is one of the fastest lifts in Europe. It does an extraordinary 25 feet a second, and it should take us only about 20 seconds to get up to the top. There we are, 34. Very impressive. Oh, wow. It would take so long to get people down from here, they decided to evacuate, if they needed to, by lift. In fact, it's the only building in the country which is allowed to be evacuated by lift. It needed special parliamentary legislation.
When it opened in 1966, the BT Tower, at an enormous 620 feet high, easily took the mantle of tallest building in London. That's as high as 25 double-decker buses stacked end to end.
Amazingly, until quite recently, this tower didn't exist. You wouldn't find it on any map, and it was classed as an official secret. So if you talked about it or took a photograph, you were technically breaking the Official Secrets Act. And then, in 1993, MP Kate Hoey took parliamentary privilege and admitted its existence in the House of Commons, and she said it was at 60 Cleveland Street, so now it's officially here. And the view from up here is truly amazing. Just look, the whole of London spread out. It actually had to be very high because they wanted to beam signals right over the Chiltern Hills there on the northern rim of the London basin. There's some really powerful aerials up there, and I'm told if I stand in exactly the right place, I may block out EastEnders and everyone will have to switch to ITV.
An intriguing thing about tall buildings is the effect a bit of wind has on them. They actually start to wobble about. I went to meet Professor Chris Wise to find out how engineers deal with this problem.
Now, Chris, they tell me that the BT Tower sways 20 centimetres in the wind. How does that happen?
Well, you'd expect it to move a bit. It's a bit like a gigantic tree, and you see when the wind blows on a tree, it sways around. Everything has a sort of natural oscillation, so if I push sideways as if I'm the wind, I can just push it over.
Right.
And the more whippy this thing is, the further it goes, and the more uncomfortable you feel when you're at the top. So what we tend to do is join those together.
Right.
So this is more conventional tall building structure, a bit like a ladder. And you can see if I try and push this sideways, it still moves around, but it's much more stable.
Rigid, yes.
Of course, if you then start putting people in, as soon as you push it sideways when the wind blows, the weight then adds to the tendency of the building to try and fall over.
Right.
When you get to 50 stories and above, you have to be a bit cleverer. And so something like the gherkin, you can see it's got these diagonal lines now going through it. If I push that sideways, each of those squares is turning itself into a diamond.
Yes.
If I try and push triangles sideways, they stay as triangles. So it's a much stronger structure. So if I push that around, you can see it's very, very rigid.
Oh yes,
See that?
you can see it has got a natural frequency, but
very fast.
It's a very high frequency,
And it doesn't
isn't it?
move, when I push it, it doesn't move anything like as far now.
No.
Playing with wire is all good fun, but what about the real thing? The gherkin arrived on the London skyline in 2004. I arranged to meet Chris the following day to go and have a look.
So, Chris, these great chunks here, does this correspond to that crisscross structure?
Yeah, this is inside here. It sounds hollow, but inside there are the huge bits of structural steelwork, and they form a big skeleton made of these diagonals and these black horizontals here.
Right.
And the whole thing carries the weight of the building, and at the same time acts as a big rigid frame which stops the thing blowing over when the wind blows.
Okay. They seem to have missed out a bit of floor here. Is that just a mistake?
No, this is a really important part of the whole architectural and environmental design of the building. They act as giant ventilation shafts which take all the hot air that's generated in the building and all the hot air that comes from the sun, take it up to the top there, and at which point it's extracted away. And what that means is that the whole of the inside of the building stays cooler, which means you can use much less energy to cool it all down.
Right.
So altogether, this building operates on 60% of the energy that's needed for a traditional skyscraper.
Really? Wow.
The Gherkin is an extraordinary building, both structurally and visually. But at less than 600 feet high, it's not the tallest building in London. To see that, I need to take a trip on a boat.
Of the 10 highest buildings in London, no fewer than 7 are on Canary Wharf, there. And the highest one of all is the one with the pyramid on top. Number 1, Canada Square. It's not just the highest in London, it's the highest in the whole of Britain.
1 Canada Square stands at 800 feet and was completed in 1991. And who better to tell us about this towering structure than John Pagano, who is in charge of construction.
John, why doesn't this building sink into the ground?
Well, we've got very strong foundations. There are 222 1.5 meter diameter piles that are driven into the ground, almost 18 meters below the surface of the ground level. And on top of that, we installed a 3 meter thick concrete raft over the whole area of the building, and on that we stand the steel structure that supports the building. I mean, we built this building in 3 years, which is...
In 3 years?
In 3 years.
That lot?
That lot. And literally, what ended up happening is the trades chased each other up the building, so the steel structure was racing up ahead at 3 floors every 2 weeks, and right behind it, the concrete contractor, the cladding, the stainless steel panels that you see were only a couple of floors behind, and they literally chased each other up the building.
Fantastic.
1 Canada Square is crowned by a distinctive pyramid, and because it's so tall, it's topped by an aircraft warning light. It flashes 40 times a minute.
Here we are, in the pyramid at the very top. Is it true that no film crew's ever been up here before?
Oh, you are the first film crew to be up here.
Fantastic, fantastic. It's wonderful. It's quite noisy. What's going on?
Well, we have all the cooling towers that are used to reject the heat from the building.
Okay.
So there's 7 of them up here, and basically we take the heat that's generated by lights, computers, and people down on the office floors, and we basically dissipate it at the top of the building.
Dump it. My specs are misting up here. So this is very damp, warm air coming up here, and it's just damp, isn't it? Yes. Do terrible things to your hair up here. They'll never be the same again. The view from up here is amazing. I'm told that when it's clear you can see for 30 miles. But one of the things that really appeals to me about this place is that there are birds. Listen, just under here. Come and have a look at this. These boxes here are for swifts, although there aren't real ones in here yet. They're trying to attract them in. You see there's a CD player playing swift squeakings all the time, trying to bring the swifts in, which just shows that although we've learnt to build up into the sky, we know who the sky really belongs to.
London's skyline has changed beyond recognition since the 50s, and it's set to go on surprising us. There's about to be another explosion of new tall buildings, like the London Bridge Tower, already nicknamed the Shard of Glass. It'll be the tallest building in Europe at a staggering 1,016 feet high.
Skyscrapers are all about seeing differently, quite literally. One of the things I love about these great towers is their links with the past. Christopher Wren, when he built St Paul's, used mathematics. He designed it with mathematical principles, and today's architects and engineers use computers, computer-aided design and computer modelling. And the next big one, the Shard of Glass, is going to be a little bit like the spires of Wren's churches, reaching ever further for the sky. Railways are part of the fabric of London, and love them or hate them, without them, the city couldn't function, and it certainly wouldn't have grown to the size it is today. London's sometimes troubled relationship with the train began more than 150 years ago. I've come to the Kew Bridge Steam Museum to find out how the railways came to London. This lovely little loco was originally built to shift slate round a quarry in Wales, but she's just like all the locomotives that took coal from barges on the Thames up to boiler houses inland. And basically she's the younger sister of the big steam locomotives that brought trains into London from north, south, east and west, smashing down slums and causing new suburbs to be built. Now, Phil, how's she going?
Not so bad, thank you very much.
Good. Will she ride with me on board?
Oh yeah, I think we can.
Go on, let's go.
Right.
The world's first ever steam locomotive was built by the brilliant Cornish mining engineer Richard Trevithick in South Wales. This was 1804 and it pulled 10 tons of pig iron from the Penydarren Ironworks down to the bay at Abercynon. Now, tell me how Trevithick brought the steam loco to London.
Well, obviously with 1804 and the Penydarren tramway worked so well, he decided that he would broaden his horizons and came up to London with his roundabout railway called Catch Me If You Can Railway.
So this was a sort of fairground ride?
Fairground ride, charged a penny, but unfortunately wasn't financially successful.
Trevithick's circular railway at Euston Square ran for only 2 months. It had one major problem. The weight of the 8-ton engine kept cracking the rail.
Trevithick broke all the rails?
Yes, because of the heavy weight of the engine, they were using wood and iron rails. The engine was breaking the rails on the joint.
Trevithick's rails were made of brittle cast iron, and it wasn't until George Stephenson came up with a wrought iron alternative that the railway age really arrived.
Thanks very much indeed. Great ride. The first railway built specially for passengers ran from Liverpool to Manchester and opened in 1830. The line was surveyed and built by George Stephenson, and the locomotive, Rocket, brilliant leading-edge technology, was built by his son Robert. Now, the first railway didn't come to London for another 6 years after that, and when it did come, it had to come in by a rather unusual route. Now, building a railway line from the country into London obviously wasn't going to be easy, particularly when they had to come through built-up areas like this. The first railway line to be built came from Greenwich and was finished in 1836, and they avoided the problem of having to plough through all these houses and businesses by leapfrogging the roads and doing the whole thing at roof level. Look at this, on a viaduct, no fewer than 878 arches. Now, there were some advantages to this. It meant they had to buy less land than if they'd done it at ground level. But there was a problem too, because the hundreds of navvies who built this thing used so many bricks every day that they caused a nationwide brick shortage. Isn't it wonderful? The venture was financially risky, and the company was obviously worried about losing money because they hedged their bets in every way they could think of. As well as the railway up there, they also built a footpath, and they charged pedestrians for the privilege of walking along beside the tracks. They even tried to sell off the arches themselves for housing, but it never did catch on. I guess it might have been a tad noisy living actually underneath a railway line.
Nearly 170 years later, the viaduct is still in use. Trains run all the way to Dover now. Even though it was expensive, the train service itself still proved popular. Surprisingly though, the idea of commuter lines didn't immediately take off. All the next railways into London were not intended for commuters at all, but for freight. And they were more often than not promoted by businessmen from other parts of the country who wanted to get their goods to markets in London.
During the 1820s and 30s, Birmingham businessmen were sending 1,000 tons of goods to London every week by canal, and they thought probably they ought to have a railway. So they consulted the great George Stephenson, and he said, "I suggest you employ my son Robert to build it." So they did, and he built the Birmingham-London Railway. It was a colossal job. He employed 20,000 men, and it took them almost 5 years. And one of the biggest engineering feats on the whole line was this cutting here. This is Chalk Farm. And it may not look very deep, it's maybe 15, 20 feet, but the fact is this goes for 30 miles all the way to Tring. Now they had to do it just with picks and shovels and wheelbarrows. There were no bulldozers or anything, it was pure manual labour by the navvies. And it said that it took as much manual labour to dig this cutting as to build one of the great pyramids of Egypt. Amazing.
The terminus of the new railway line was at Euston. The Victorians built elaborate and imposing stations in order to reassure their passengers that rail travel was safe. This neoclassical arch stood until the 1960s, when developers levelled it when they redesigned the station on what they thought were more practical lines. These gatehouses are all that remain. Rumour has it that the arch itself is at the bottom of the Lee River. Not all Victorian railway stations were destroyed, some still survive, like this gem, St Pancras.
The Victorians loved building huge, great railway stations with massive engine sheds, and this is St Pancras, from the great Victorian building at the end to this huge arch here. They really liked showing off. And now it's a building site because Eurostar is going to come here, and the Eurostar trains are 400 metres long, so they've had to extend it all the way to there, double the length of the engine sheds. It's going to be fantastic, and you'll be able to go direct from here to Paris in 2¼ hours. All I need is a ticket. To find out how this vast building site works, I've come to meet the contract manager, Ailey McAdam. Ailey, how many chaps have you got working here?
About 850 at the moment.
Wow. Who built this building in the first place?
William Barlow, he was the designer and he also supervised the construction. Tremendous achievement. At its time, this was the largest single arch building in the world.
Now, surely the roof's always been black corrugated iron, hasn't it?
No, what you see there is a temporary cover.
So what was there before?
Ridge and furrow, which is like valley
glass.
And trough, glass. And we're returning it back to its former glory, so to speak.
You're putting in glass again?
That's right. We have light streaming down into the shed, making this whole building feel completely different than it does at the moment.
Well, I think that's absolutely fantastic. Can we go and have a look downstairs?
Let's go.
Right. So now we're down underneath the platforms, right? The trains are coming up there.
That's right.
And this is underground.
Yes.
And this is still Victorian.
Yeah, this is what we call the undercroft, which was created because when Barlow was looking at building St Pancras Station, he decided to come in over the canal rather than under the canal. Our next door station, King's Cross, comes under the canal and the platform's there at a ground level.
Right.
Because he came in over the canal, he had to elevate the platforms at the first floor, creating this huge void underneath, which was a massive basement.
Yes.
Which he actually used it as beer storage.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the big reasons for creating St Pancras was the Midlands at the time were booming, coal and beer, and he wanted to be the main outlet for the whole of London. So he used this area as for storing beer.
This would be full of barrels then?
Full of barrels. An interesting fact is that the distance between these columns is exactly 3 beer barrel lengths. That was one of his design specifications.
Wonderful. So these are original Victorian columns?
They are. They're cast iron columns. They've been here for 150 years.
Now look, I don't want to worry you in any way, but there does seem to be a hole here. Is that deliberate, or have you made a mistake?
Part of our design is to cut a hole in the old train deck slab, and what that will do when light will stream down from the new roof that we're putting on.
Right, so that's all going to be glass?
That's all going to be glass. Stream down through the glass into this area here, and we're reusing this area to house passengers for the international departures, arrivals, passport control, customs, immigration. We're reusing this vast space.
Let's go and have a look upstairs. And this is part of one of the arches holding up the roof, yes?
That's right.
It's enormously high.
It is. Something that Barlow was very keen on. He wanted to make a big mark, a big statement. It was the main line coming into London and this was their building. So he was very keen to make it higher than King's Cross.
They did like big nuts and bolts, didn't they?
They did, yeah. This is what we call a boot.
Right.
So this ties the arch, which we just talked about, into the cross tie.
Okay.
Which we saw from down below.
Right.
Which keeps the feet of the arch together.
Right.
And then in turn, connects down into the columns.
Right.
To go down deep.
Okay, so they're sitting on the columns in the earth.
That's right.
So tell me about what you actually sit on top of the pillars.
Well, over here we can see a bearing.
So this is the top of one of those cast iron columns, yes?
Cast iron column is underneath here.
Right.
And this is a bearing we put on top of every...
Just this piece?
That's it.
So the whole of the deck is going to sit on these bearings, and then it will be able to move sideways. Oh, hey, I can move it.
That's right.
So the trains will move it inches, I would think. Well, centimetres in your world.
That's right. So the concrete deck can move independently from the cast and mortine structure.
That's really cunning.
Yeah.
Anyway, you've only got another week or two on here, haven't you? Well, good luck. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks.
There's also some redevelopment work going on round the front of the station, where the Victorians built that vital part of any railway development, a grand hotel. In 1868, the Midland Railway built their new station at St Pancras. But the building most of us recognise as St Pancras isn't actually the station at all.
In 1873, St Pancras Station was joined by the Midland Grand Hotel next door, built by George Gilbert Scott. Now, the chap who knows about it is Angus Bogue. Hello, Angus, who's managing director. Now, I gather that Scott had built only churches and workhouses before this.
Well, that's right. And he entered the competition for the Midland Hotel, and he decided that what he was going to do was this was his last chance to build a grand Gothic revival building. So he poured every last piece of opulence into this building and very nearly busted the Midland Railway in doing it.
Wonderful. And it is ludicrously over the top, isn't it? What are these columns made of?
These are solid marble, and then you see some gold paint above, and you can see the effort that went into the decoration at the high level of these walls.
Right. Now, what were the problems that stopped it being, you know, the grandest hotel in London for the next century?
Well, it was the grandest hotel in London when it opened, but it had certain issues.
Right.
One was that there were only 8 bathrooms.
8 bathrooms?
For 240 bedrooms.
But that means you'd have to queue for an hour.
Well, you have a bath brought to your room by your servants, and this was the other problem, is that social change meant that people didn't travel with their servants.
Right. Now, what's the grandest thing in the whole building?
Well, the grandest thing in the building is the grand stair, and I think we should go and have a look.
Okay, after you.
The grand staircase has more than 800 steps, and the best bits at the top.
So what were some of the other problems?
There were no lifts, no running water in the rooms, no central heating, and no electricity.
Yes, I guess that would be slightly difficult.
Not all the hotel's guests were well behaved. The Australian cricket team of 1930 were particularly troublesome.
They stayed on the 5th floor, apparently, and used it for net practice when the weather was a bit grotty. But they did do a tremendous amount of damage, and were sent a bill for the repairs afterwards.
Good, good.
Just like rock stars.
So this is the top of the grand staircase, and I'm very carefully not looking down. It's quite high enough to terrify me. The painting here is quite spectacular, isn't it?
Well, that's right. This is chastity here and temperance over there.
I thought the Australians stayed up here.
Well, they obviously didn't read the signs.
Wonderful. And the whole roof covered with stars.
That's right. And this really is a magnificent piece of painting, and this has been restored fairly recently, as a matter of fact.
You're going to turn this back into a hotel, yes?
That's right. Well, it was a fantastic 5-star hotel, but because of the problems that I mentioned earlier, it closed in 1935, and really, apart from being used very briefly as offices for British Rail, the building's been empty ever since. So after 70 years, we're going to bring it back as a 5-star hotel, probably the best 5-star railway hotel in Europe.
Wonderful. The Midland Railway Company really spent money on this building to make it such an opulent place. And I can't help wondering why. Well, one chap who knows is Roydon Stock. Now, this is a very elegant room, isn't it? Fabulous ceiling.
Yes, a wonderful room, built as the boardroom for the Midland Railway. It overlooks their nearest rival, the Great Northern. And I like to imagine their General Manager, James Joseph Allport, standing up here with a big catapult, trying to smash the windows in. Yes.
But it's funny because that's a really boring building, isn't it? There's no doubt about it.
It's boring but functional,
yes.
Certainly functional.
Whereas this building is beautiful but dysfunctional. Yes.
bit of a white elephant in its day, and as Scott said himself, almost too good for its own use.
Now, you said they'd be taking out the windows with a catapult. Was there really a lot of rivalry between different companies?
Yes, there was. After the Great Exhibition of 1851, the Midland Railway realised they needed to build their own line into London. So they really wanted to make an impression here. As well as building a station, they wanted to show off. And they wanted to bring in things from the Midlands. This was to be a showcase for the Midlands as well. The bricks on the outside are from Loughborough, Nottingham. The stonework is Ancaster, Ketton. The tiles on the roof were from Leicestershire, mainly. It's all from the Midlands.
Amazing. Not all of London's stations are quite as grand as St Pancras, but the remarkable thing is that the city has so many main line stations, 12 in all. Landowners and Parliament tried to keep the railways out of the centre of the city, and so we have an arc of stations in North London from east to west, and the big three in the south. Only Charing Cross and Victoria are really in the centre. But all this led to terrible congestion on the roads between all these stations. A solution was desperately needed.
I'm sitting here with Christian Woolmer, who's just written the definitive book about the London Underground. Christian, why did London need an underground?
Well, if you imagine London in the mid-Victorian age, it was a very crowded place. The roads were complete chaos. There were carts, there were horses, carriages, probably something like Calcutta is today. And so they really had to kind of think, what can we do about this?
How did they actually build the line?
Well, the early underground railways were built by cut and cover. They basically dug up the streets, put a railway inside and covered it over again. And that was kind of pretty crude way of doing it, but it was very effective.
Cut and cover was a messy business. Every time a new line was dug, whole neighbourhoods were thrown into disarray.
Underneath the roads was a mass of cables, pipes, sewers and all sorts of stuff, which they kept digging up. And then they left piles of dirt and tools all over the roads, and eventually people started to complain. And the Metropolitan did make some attempt to compensate them, but only in rich areas. Poor people who were thrown out of slums got nothing when the slums were pulled down. Here in posh Bayswater, where they extended the Metropolitan line, they made an attempt to cover up the mess. And if you look here, there's a very elegant row of houses. And if you come along this side, suddenly, look, all the windows are fake. They've been painted over. And if you look at the front door here, there's no handle. There's no letterbox. It's concrete. Messenger boys and postmen, young new postmen, have been sent here ever since to play jokes on them, because there's no house here. It's just a front. And behind it, there's nothing but a railway line. Come and have a look. Here we are. Here's the back of that same bit. Look! A tube line right underneath. There's no house. In the old days, you see, they had to leave a hole to allow all the smoke and steam to come out. Now they don't need the hole, but there's just a gap between the houses held up by those great girders. It is wonderful.
The advent of electric trains and new tunnelling techniques meant that deep level tube lines were able to be built. This led to a massive expansion of the underground network in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
What influence did the underground have on the way that London was built?
Wherever it went, if there were green fields there when it was built, within a few years, most of the green fields would be gone, because basically it stimulated the growth of housing. So in a way, the transport system was built before the houses were there. It created a London, as it were.
Railways changed the face of London forever. Not only were new suburbs built, but old areas were knocked down and populations were uprooted.
Here at the Acton Depot, I'm surrounded by ancient trains of every colour and vintage. But I wonder what effect the railways had on the people when they were first built. The head curator at the London Transport Museum is Oliver Green. Oliver, what were the consequences of the building of the railways for the people who lived there?
Well, it would depend who you are, really. The railways were both destroyers and creators in many ways, because they came to London just not through great neighbourhoods of London, usually the poorer neighbourhoods. And obviously for the people there, it meant they lost their homes, they had to move somewhere else, there was no compensation for them. But at the same time, once the railways were established, they were creating jobs, they were bringing more opportunities to London, they were bringing goods to London, passengers to London. And in that sense, they were quite a creative impact. on London.
How were working class people able to take advantage of the railways?
There was the Cheap Trains Act, which tried to force the railway companies to offer cheap transport to working class people who'd been displaced when the railways came into London. And the hope was that these people would be able to move out to Edmonton, Enfield, somewhere like that, and commute into work. Of course, in practice, it was never the same people. And those who've been displaced probably they couldn't afford to move out, even at the cheap rates. And again, there is a sort of division between East and West here, because the Great Eastern Railway, who had extended into Liverpool Street from their original terminus at Bishopsgate, part of the price of doing that was they had to offer cheap fares.
Oh, I see. Okay, right.
And they actually set about that with quite some relish, and that's remained to this day. That if you go, Liverpool Street is still one of the busiest stations. There are a huge number of trains coming in at rapid intervals, coming in from the northeastern suburbs, which from that day onwards, and still to this day, are much more in the way of working class suburbs of London, and of course the whole of East London is to some extent. It's probably no exaggeration to say that the railways have done more to shape London than anything else. It's something everybody uses, and there's no other city that has that kind of link-in with railways are the complete lifeblood of the city. They were in the 19th century, and they are today.
Railways may seem endlessly frustrating to the modern commuter, but slowly improvements are being made to the ageing infrastructure of the original railway city.
With the world's first overground and underground rail networks, railways have always had an important effect on the development of the city. And because there are always extensions in the pipeline, that's going to go on into the future. And that means that Londoners can move away from the centre and still remain within easy reach of their workstations. This beautiful stretch of golden sand is known as Rotherhithe Beach, and over the other side of the river there is Wapping. And if you go way back to the 1800s, then the Port of London docks were a couple of miles upstream and London Bridge beyond them. But if you wanted to cross the river down here, it was a real problem. It's an awful long way to build a bridge, and if you did, you'd cut off the ships from the docks. So some engineers had the bright idea of going not over the river, but underneath in a tunnel.
The first attempt to build a tunnel under the Thames was made by a man called Ralph Dodd in 1798. He tried to build a tunnel between Gravesend and Tilbury, but he quickly ran into quicksand and out of money. In 1807, Richard Trevithick, the man responsible for inventing the steam locomotive, began work on a tunnel between Rotherhithe and Limehouse, but this caved in and was completely flooded. Work never resumed.
The chap who built the first successful tunnel under the Thames was Brunel. Not the flamboyant Isambard Kingdom Brunel, but his dad, Mark Brunel, who was a French engineer. Now the story goes that Mark, when he was working at Chatham Dockyard, was inspired by seeing a thing called a shipworm, Teredo nivalis, which used to bore its way into the oak timbers of ships, and eventually they crumbled. Now this walking stick has a handle made of driftwood, and I'm told that those wormholes are not actually woodworm, but shipworm, that is, Teredo nivalis.
The shipworm bores through wood using its powerful jaws and then lines the tunnel it's made with a hard excretion. This is what gave Mark Brunel the inspiration for the invention of the tunnelling shield. The miners would stand on platforms. In front of them were planks of wood holding back the soil. They'd unscrew one plank, remove 18 inches of soil from behind it, then push the plank into the hole. Then they'd unscrew the next plank and do the same. Eventually, when all the planks had been moved forward, the whole structure was pushed 18 inches towards Wapping. Then the area excavated behind the shield was lined with bricks, like the hard excretion of the shipworm.
So, with the help of his fabulous tunnelling shield, Brunel hoped to be able to tunnel right across to Wapping underneath this horrible mixture of sand and gravel.
There were to be two road tunnels running parallel to each other, one to take goods and trade vehicles from north to south, and the other from south to north. Mark Brunel might have found it easier to start a few hundred yards back and dig a gentle slope downwards, but that would have caused far too much disruption to the area.
So here on the Rotherhithe Bank in 1825, he built himself an engine house. That's the black chimney at the back there. And then he built an enormous brick cylinder. This thing that looks like concrete is actually bricks. The cylinder was 50 feet wide and 40 feet high. And when they'd finished it, they dug out the earth from inside and also from just around the outside so that the whole thing sank slowly into the ground. And when it reached the bottom, and this is just the top sticking out, from the bottom of that shaft, he was able to start tunnelling under the river.
Sadly, Mark Brunel was taken ill before the tunnelling even got underway in November of 1825, and it wasn't long before his 20-year-old son, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, stepped into his father's shoes as resident engineer, bringing with him a youthful enthusiasm. But enthusiasm alone couldn't help the fact that the seam of strong London clay they started digging through was far from continuous, and Isambard began to fear there was a real possibility that the Thames might burst through at any moment.
I want to know what London's actually built on, so I've come to the lab to meet Chris, who's a materials engineer. You know about these things, do you?
Certainly do, yes.
Yeah,
Nice to meet
good.
you.
So, is this what London's built on?
Basically, North London is built on this clay, which is ideal, it's cohesive, very hard to break.
It's very hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
I thought, it's a bit like plasticine, but extremely tough.
Yeah, it's an ideal tunnelling material, basically.
Is it?
Yeah, in North London.
Because it sticks together?
Yeah, so
okay.
Very cohesive.
And what happens in the south?
In the south we have the gravels.
Right.
South of the Thames we have the gravels, as you can see, not cohesive at all.
So you can't possibly make a gravel castle because it just collapses every time.
That's correct.
So if you tunnel through it, it'll just collapse into the tunnel all the time.
Basically just collapse on itself, yeah.
And then?
We also have the sand on the south of London.
Right. And what's this like?
As you can see, breaks very easy.
It just crumbles to bits. And what, can you make a sandcastle? Well, sort of.
You sort of can.
But it's very, very difficult, isn't it?
As you say, it's compared to the clay.
Yes. There, look, I made a sandcastle.
Yeah,
That was brilliant. And what's the worst problem with this?
The worst problem with that if it's moist, etc. Water, etc.
Right. So could we have some water on?
Would you like to pour the water on?
Okay, you're on. This is the
problem.
same sand, yes?
Yeah, the same sand.
How much? A good slosh, you think?
Good slosh, as you can see.
Sort of a lot like that?
Yeah.
That's wet now. Okay, can I make a sandcastle? No, it simply collapses, doesn't it?
Exactly.
So is this what the problem was with the Brunel tunnel?
That's correct, yeah, the exact same problem.
So they started in clay, but they ran into gravel and sand.
Yeah, basically sand and gravel.
And it simply collapses.
To get a feel for what it must have been like for Brunel's miners, I decided to take a look at the tunnel myself. It's now part of the tube network between Wapping and Rotherhithe. Metronet, who now maintain the tunnel, were kind enough to show me round.
Working conditions down here must have been absolutely horrible. Imagine each miner standing in a little narrow wooden cupboard about this wide and just up to this height, and he's got these planks of wood in front of him. He's got to take one out, hack away the earth and the gravel from behind it, push it back in and down to the bottom. It's completely dark, okay? His only light is a candle, probably stuck in his hat. The air is absolutely disgusting, thick, full of smoke, full of all sorts of horrible smells. The roof is perpetually leaking, and it's not leaking water, it's leaking raw sewage, because the whole of the Thames was just an open sewer. So it must have been completely foul. Men got really ill down here. And then they had a catastrophic flood in May of 1827, and they had to wall the thing up and pump all the water out and take all the mud out, and then to celebrate the fact they were going again, they had a great feast. Martin, tell me about the feast. It must have been around here, was it?
Yes, I believe it was in this area, and there were two separate tables. I believe the gentry were in this ball here, and the workmen were in...
On the other tunnel.
It was a grand affair designed to rebuild confidence in the project. They even had the band of the Coldstream Guards on hand to play as the guests tucked into their lavish roast beef dinner.
In fact, that great celebration was a bit premature because in January of 1828 there was another catastrophic flood. Many men died and Isambard Brunel was pulled unconscious from the water with terrible internal injuries.
He was laid up for several months and began to suffer a series of hemorrhages. In fact, he took more than a year to recover. This second disaster gave the tunnel's investors the jitters. They were worried the project wouldn't be finished within the budget. In August 1828, the workers were paid off and the tunnel, which had only reached halfway, was bricked up.
We must be just about halfway now, are we? Yes. Hey, and that's Wapping, yes, that light there. And if you look the other way, that's Rotherhithe. Fantastic. So we can see the whole width of the river. And it's, how far did you say?
365 metres.
365, about 400 yards from one side to the other. And we must be right underneath the river. It's not going to start leaking, is it?
No, I think we're safe enough.
Great.
7 years after the disaster, in March 1835, tunnelling resumed, after the Treasury coughed up a £270,000 loan. But 3 more floods drained funds, and when the excavation reached the North Bank in 1841, there was no money left to build the approach roads needed for goods vehicles. Only pedestrians would be able to use the tunnel.
So now there's a sort of doorway into the other tunnel. What do you call these?
These were one of 64 passages, cross passages that were installed in the original tunnel. Understand that in the early days when it was in use as a pedestrian tunnel, lots of stall holders used to set up. And
oh really? Selling whelks and things? And no, trinkets. It's very elegant, isn't it? I mean, it's a nice, it's built to be looked at.
Indeed, and in the reconstructed section of the tunnel, we've replicated these features, so you'll see that they're pretty well identical.
Oh, fantastic. Let's go and have a look.
Martin Roach worked on the refurbishment of the tunnel in 1995. The team retained as much original brickwork as possible, and any repairs that had to be made also reflected Brunel's original design.
Given that it's concrete, the shape is absolutely gorgeous, isn't it?
Yes, it was quite elaborate.
That's fabulous. I do like that. How many of these have you done?
56 in total.
You've done 56 new cross passages. That's terrific. Why don't you set up stalls in here?
But we don't get too many people walking down here these days.
No, I guess you don't, no.
It's a shame that not many people get to see Brunel's handiwork close up. It can be easy to forget that what's now just a short stretch of tube was the first tunnel of its kind and was once even hailed as the 8th wonder of the world.
Now this is Brunel's original shaft. Look, this is the brick cylinder, his original bricks on the Wapping side. And this is one of the spiral staircases that he must have come up. I'm actually walking in the footsteps of the master, and indeed all his pedestrians must have come up the same way too.
I think it's great that such an important tunnel and shaft has been preserved so well, but in future, something tells me I'll be taking the lift.
Wow, I'm glad I don't have to do this too often. Whew. This is the Tower of London, arguably the most famous of all the London tourist attractions, visited by millions of tourists every year. But what none of them notice is this funny little building right next door. It says round the top, London Hydraulic Power Company Tower Subway, constructed AD 1868. And down under here, there is an example of what was arguably the most important step forward ever in tunnelling technology. Come down and have a look.
The tunnel, which runs right under the Thames, was constructed by James Greathead, a South African-born engineer and inventor. Originally, a lift was planned to take you the 60 feet down to the bottom of the shaft, but it didn't work very well, and a spiral staircase was put in to replace it. Unfortunately for me, not even the spiral staircase remains today.
So any advice?
Just hang on tight, mate.
Hang on tight, okay. That sounds like good advice to me. They say it's 60 feet down. It feels like about 160.
At the bottom of the shaft, I met Murray Briggs from Cable and Wireless, who now own the tunnel after buying it from the London Hydraulic Power Company.
Yes, welcome.
Wow, so these must be the high pressure water that the London Hydraulic Company was delivering, is that right?
Yes, I believe that's one of the old pipes, plus plenty of fibre optic cables that we've got through the tunnel over on the wall now.
Oh, these are fibre optics, are they?
Yes.
Ah, so now I understand why you're interested, because...
That's why we needed the tunnel.
You don't do hydraulics, do you?
No.
Of course, the Tower subway wasn't originally built for fibre optics or water pipes when it was first opened to the public in 1870.
Oh, how big is this?
It's 7 feet in diameter.
7 feet? Oh, hang on a sec. Look, I'm only 6 foot and I can bash my head on the roof.
Well, it's levelled off at the bottom.
Oh, I
That's
see.
where the tracks for the railway used to be.
They didn't run a railway through
They
here.
did.
I don't believe it.
It was a very small carriage that would just shuttle backwards and forwards on a rope, effectively.
Right, rope on a piece of string. They didn't
Yes.
have a locomotive.
No.
I see.
It's
How
just-
many people would sit on it?
It was 14.
14.
14 people.
So here they've got tyres. Look, this really nice crisscross pattern here. Very elegant. Do you think they were there for the railway?
No, the railway only actually lasted for 3 months.
Really?
Yes.
But I guess it couldn't have made any money, could
No,
it?
it wasn't a success. 14 people at a time. There just weren't enough
Hopeless.
people going through
Hopeless.
to make any money.
So what did they do then?
They ripped that out and it was just a foot tunnel.
Oh, so that's why they wanted tiles.
Yes.
Right.
They just put a staircase at either end and charged people a halfpenny to come through.
Well, I bet they didn't get any customers, did they? I mean,
They did $1 million a year.
$1 million a year.
year.
That's 20,000 a week.
Yes.
Now, how did they make it? This is presumably cast iron, is it?
It is. This was revolutionary in its day. Brunel had built his tunnel down the river a few years beforehand. About
50 years, yeah.
Yes. That took 15 years to
Yeah.
build. But this tunnel, when it went through, was done in 10 months.
10 months?
Yes. And it cost £16,000.
That's amazing.
It was the Great Edge Shield was the technology they used.
So what's different about that?
Well, Brunel had used a shield to go through, which is
Yes.
effectively just a construction at the front of the tunnel to support the tunnel as you build it.
Yeah.
But here they used a round wrought iron shield with a little door in that was effectively just pushed into the clay. They opened the door, one man stepped through, dug some clay out until there was room for another man to join him.
Right.
And then they dig as much clay out as they could.
Right.
Then the whole thing would, there were screw jacks, excuse my head, screw jacks that pushed against the cast iron.
And just shoved the whole thing
just pushed
forward.
it forward, and then they put another section of the tunnelling.
Right, and just bolted it in. And it's all just bolted in.
Another thing James Greathead's new tunnelling shield had over Brunel's almost square shield was, of course, its shape.
This is a modern tunnel designed for commuter trains, actually for Thames Link. And it's virgin. You can see they haven't put the floor in, they haven't put the railway lines and various other bits of gubbins. And you can see because of that it's a perfect circle in cross-section, which is because that's an inherently strong shape. You see, if you have a flat roof on a tunnel, there are terrific forces from above, and eventually it's liable to give. But if you have a circle, that spreads the forces. Engineers call them hoop forces, and the forces go round the outside of the tunnel, and it's not going to buckle. It's a wonderful shape for a tunnel.
Unsuccessful as a rail tunnel, the Tower subway took another blow. Pedestrians stopped using it when Tower Bridge opened in 1894 and they could cross the Thames for free. But Greathead's work had not gone unnoticed, and he was about to use his tunnelling shield on a far more ambitious project.
Until the late 1880s, underground railways in London were built just below the surface, in cuttings, and then roofed over afterwards. This was called the cut and cover method, but it was very disruptive and also very expensive. So in 1886, Greathead was appointed to dig a deep tube railway, deep underground, from the city to the southern suburbs, specifically to Stockwell in South London. This eventually became part of the Northern Line. But going deep underground like that posed another problem for them, because steam trains couldn't operate deep down and they had to find a new method of propulsion.
The solution was the new technology of electric traction. Although electric tramways were becoming common in the United States of America, no one had ever tried to build an electric railway, let alone an underground one.
This is the Acton Depot of the London Transport Museum, and I'm with Christian Woolmer, who's written the definitive book about the London Underground. Now, Christian, what's interesting or special about this lump of machinery here?
Well, this is the first locomotive, electric locomotive, to be used on the London Underground. Basically, when they started building underground systems deep under the London clay, they couldn't use steam, and they had to have electric power.
And I guess once they got electric propulsion, they could dig a lot more lines.
Well, this was the whole change that enabled London to basically get a big network of underground lines, because initially there were steam lines near the surface, and now with electricity and with deep tunnel digging, they were able to build a whole network. And so we got 3 or 4 lines built, largely by an American called Charles Yerkes, who was a bit of a crook, because we're not quite sure how he raised his money, and his shareholders didn't do very well. But at least he gave us the Piccadilly line, part of the Northern line, the Bakerloo line, all in the space of 4 or 5 years.
So you say Yerkes was a bit of a crook. How did he actually raise the money?
Well, actually, Yerkes was one of the first people to really use what later became known as junk bonds. Essentially, he issued paper on the basis of kind of promising to pay people lots of money, but which never really materialised, raised a lot of money like that, some staggering amount of money, £16 million, wow, and paid for the system to be built. But we have to be very grateful to him, because without him, we might not have all these tube lines.
So, despite being great leaps forward in technology, all the tunnels we've looked at so far proved to be financial disasters. I went to see London's newest deep-level tunnel, the Channel Tunnel Rail Link at St Pancras, to find out how Brunel and Greathead's principles have evolved. I hoped that today's tunnellers were having fewer money worries than their predecessors.
In the old days, they dug tunnels by hand, but these were dug using a tunnel boring machine, or TBM. The TBMs are fantastic. They're 100 metres long. They weigh 1,100 tons. They're completely self-contained with a galley and loos and all that sort of stuff on board, and they work 24 hours a day. They have great big teeth in front to chew up the earth, and they spit it out the back onto a conveyor belt. And what they do is they go forward about 1.5 meters, which takes about half an hour. Then they stop, and out the back they take these concrete segments to form the lining. They're picked up by a sucker. Boom. 10 of them form a complete ring. They weigh 3 tons each. Absolutely extraordinary. And when they've made a complete ring, then the TBM moves forward again. I've come now right into the tunnel, right into the solid concrete here, and they tell me I'm 20 metres underground, which is a little bit scary, but actually there's a lot of tunnel and there's a lovely fresh air blowing through. And the chap who knows all about it is Gordon here. I think you live down here, is that right, Gordon?
More or less, yes. Yeah.
Now tell me, this is obviously the newest tunnel in London, I guess, is it?
Yes, indeed it is, yes.
And how much does it owe to all those pioneers, to the Brunels and to Greathead?
It owes very much, a lot to James Greathead in particular. And these tunnels were driven with state-of-the-art tunnel boring machines that still adopt that same principle today.
This is all concrete, which is obviously they didn't use. Do you have any ironwork at all down here?
Yes, we do. We've still got some of the old techniques in use, and we've used some of those techniques down here, so those hand techniques.
Ah, hey, this looks like some of those old tunnels. Looks bolted together by hand?
Bolted together by hand, yes.
And presumably this is steel, modern stuff.
No, it's not steel, it's cast iron, more or less the same cast iron that's been in use for over 150 years.
Really?
Probably traced back to 1860.
How much influence do you think those early miners and their techniques have had on the shaping of the whole city?
Significant. Without those early traditional techniques being developed, we would not be London tunnels, London tunnelling, or London would not be where it is today.
Those early pioneering tunnels that may not have made so much financial sense at the time have ultimately left a far greater legacy.
The technology that's developed since Brunel's original tunnelling shield over 150 years ago has allowed this vast and complex city to be woven together by hundreds of interconnecting underground tunnels lying below the streets of London. In fact,
underground transport is now an integral part of every world city.